In his support for Black Lives Matter and defunding the police, Atlanta City Council member Antonio Brown voted to defund the police department in Atlanta by $73 million. The vote barely failed, just by one vote. It almost happened. And now we have a story going viral. This Atlanta City Council member was at a ribbon-cutting ceremony when a group of children carjacked him, or jumped into his car and stole it, dragging him down the street. What's fascinating about the story is that the man is doubling down on his rhetoric and his calls for some kind of defunding of the police or some kind of police reform, saying this is clearly the fault of the system. And that's the problem with this ideology, or perhaps lack thereof. Maybe these people just want power, and so they must maintain the lie. They can never accept that what their policies are doing are causing massive damage. And so we get language from this man where he says it's clearly an issue of systemic racism and desperation. And oh, these poor children who carjacked me. What I find funny about this council member's statements is that even affluent children commit crimes. So how about you enforce the law and stop people from committing crimes, even if they are children? It is a bankrupt ideology, and we are seeing the ramifications of this in many other cities. Crime, of course, is skyrocketing, and it's particularly bad in places where the left is gaining more and more power, notably in Portland, who saw their murder rate climb by 800%. I think the actual number is like 766, but we'll round up. How about that? And now the real ramifications. Many cities are rolling back their defunding measures, and they are, quote, refunding the police. I'll stress this because it was really funny the first time I heard refund the police, because I was like, wait, refund them what? Like, what did they buy? Like, you got to give them their money back. Oh, no. You mean provide them funding again, because defunding the police clearly didn't work. I guess I can bring up every single segment I've ever done pointing out that this is backfiring. And now we can see exactly what the problem is. While many of these cities are forced to reconcile with their failures, you still have people like this Atlanta City Council member who's doubling down on the rhetoric. And because he is a spineless jellyfish of a politician, he won't acknowledge what the problem is. You need law enforcement. Now, he's not completely wrong. Crime and poverty do breed. Poverty does breed crime, and crime does contribute to the expansion of poverty. It's very difficult to gain wealth when people are robbing each other. And so you need something to change all of this. And I think at the very least, you can take a look at how the suburbs are behaving, because I covered this the other day. In the suburbs, the police have actually started arresting more people for lower level crimes, and crime has not escalated to murder. In the cities where they've demanded reforms, it's the opposite. In minority neighborhoods, crime and murder specifically is on the rise, and they're not arresting people. In this instance, the Atlanta City Council member may have gotten some comeuppance as police didn't respond to the carjacking. Let's read the story, though, and I'll break down all of the nitty-gritty details, show you exactly what he says, and then we'll talk about all of these cities that are backpedaling and saying, you know what? The cops actually need more funding. Before we get started, head over to timcast.com and become a member. Just click the big members only button and you can sign up with Stripe or PayPal. This helps my company grow. Your membership allows us to hire more journalists, create new programs. So if you really think what I talk about is important, become a member. And the most important thing you can do, seriously, if everybody who watched this video shared the video, I'd be bigger than CNN overnight. And that's not an exaggeration. So if you really care, then please consider sharing. Please like this video and subscribe to this channel. And when you become a member at timcast.com, you get exclusive content, the members only segment. So check it out. There's a bunch of really awesome stuff, really serious stuff, and a lot of stuff YouTube doesn't let us talk about. Now, let's break down this news story. WSB TV reports Atlanta City Council member has car stolen by kids while meeting with community leaders. And of course, we can see from the Ground News extension, it is overwhelmingly conservatives reporting this story. Why? Well, for obvious reasons, it does make the left look bad, but you still have left-wing sources reporting on this. They say, Atlanta City Council member Antonio Brown said he was on hold with 911 for 5 full minutes after children stole his car Wednesday. Brown is one of 4 candidates in the Atlanta's mayor's race this year, in which crime has become a driving issue. The councilman told Channel 2's Tom Regan that he was meeting up with people to discuss plans to build affordable housing in the area. Moments after he stepped out of his car, a group of kids jumped in and took it. Quote, "These kids were, in my opinion, somewhere between 7 and 11 years old. So you don't immediately think, oh, these kids are going to steal my car," Brown said. Brown said he had no sooner walked a few feet from his unlocked Mercedes to speak with someone when a group of kids, school-aged kids, jumped in and hit the push-button ignition. He was meeting with Ben Norman of the Dixie Hills Neighborhood Association at the time. Ben attempted to open the door to get the driver out of the car. He fought with Ben. I then engaged and tried to get him out of the car, Brown said. But the young thieves wouldn't stop and sped down the street. The driver started to hit on the gas. Ben let go. And then the kids started to drag me half a block, Brown said. Now, here's where it gets really, really sad and pathetic. He says, I got some scratches and stuff because they took off in the car, and I kind of fell down on the ground for a minute. He started to speed up, and I knew if I had not let go, I could have killed myself. That's what he said. I could have killed myself. What? Bro, this kid was the one doing it. Just like what we saw in D.C. When the guy was in his car and the 2 young girls jumped in, and then he was trying to get him out of the car. They drove and slammed the door into it was a light post, I believe. And that man lost his life. He didn't kill himself. This kid who stole your car was dragging you. It's not your fault. Accept responsibility. He says, quote, because he was going so fast, I would start to tumble and I didn't want to hurt him. This is the problem we have with these leftist politicians. This is a failure of an individual to recognize what it means to be a leader and for there to be discipline. A bad leader refuses to acknowledge their faults. A bad leader punishes those beneath them and oppresses them because of problems, because of their own mistakes. A good leader recognizes when they have to take responsibility, not blaming yourself because someone committed a crime. No, he doesn't want to take responsibility for his own ideology, for wanting to defund the police. So he says, I could have hurt him. That is not someone you want leading your city. The councilman said it took police 45 minutes to arrive because 911 incorrectly assigned it as a low priority dispatch. How much do you want to bet? It's because he called 911 and said, I'm just worried about these kids. I almost hurt him. Look at what he's saying. I almost killed myself, but please have these kids get found. They're just poor children. So they said, okay, low priority. And now he's mad at the cops and 911. He said the kids who stole his car he said the kids who stole his car acted out of hopelessness and desperation. This is a generational poverty issue. These kids, it's 12:30 in the afternoon. Why aren't they in school? Why aren't we enforcing systems to ensure that if they're not in school, they're in recreational centers, Brown said. Could it be because you demonize the police and defund them? And who do you think is going to pick them up for truancy? Who is supposed to respond to these calls? I'm sorry, these people are not well. They are either the most ignorant or the most deceptive because he just wants power and that's the game he's playing, or he's too stupid to realize it's the cops. They're the ones who do this. The councilman said he doesn't intend to file criminal charges against the young people who stole his car, which has not yet been found. Now, a lot of people are pointing out this guy tried to defund the police. It didn't work. We have this story from last year. Atlanta City Council votes down withholding police funding. They say it was a narrow vote. The city council narrowly voted down an ordinance that would have withheld $73 million of the Atlanta Police Department's budget. The 7-8 vote came after 2 teleconference council meetings and a listening session in this past week, during which the council heard thousands of voicemails of a public comment. Many called for them to defund the police, as a handful of other cities have done in the aftermath of mass demonstrations. So they go on to mention that Antonio Brown was one of these people. He voted for it. He voted for the provision to defund the police. Now, regardless of whether or not that succeeded, I want to stress it didn't, because a lot of people are saying, he voted to defund the police, but they weren't defunded. So perhaps the reason the police are unable to respond is demoralization, or just a fear that we will be arrested and charged. If I was a cop in Atlanta and they were like, a bunch of kids stole a car, I'd be like, yeah, right. I'm not going anywhere near that. Nowhere near it. And what did he say? Generational poverty. I seem to recall in my youth a bunch of wealthy suburbanite Chicagoans who cut class all the time and went joyriding, crimes being committed, drinking, doing drugs. In fact, I think that's probably like the rich kids were more likely to do it than the poor kids because the poor kids had to work to support their families or hustle in some way. But that's probably not true. It's probably just kids do these things. So you get law enforcement and you get cops to stop them and you put a stop on the escalation of the crime. I don't know exactly what the right answer is to solving all of this, but I can tell you getting rid of the cops seems to be backfiring. Now, although they didn't defund the police, we still saw in the wake of Rayshard Brooks' killing, Atlanta mayor orders police department reforms. So there you go. We saw the blue flu in Atlanta. You remember that? A bunch of cops called in sick. I think it was like 20% of the department. A bunch of cops quit. There was a no-go zone set up and the Wendy's was burnt to the ground. Why? Because a guy who was driving drunk, fell asleep in a Wendy's drive-thru. And then when the cops tried arresting him, he punched one of the cops or he fought with them and the one cop got a concussion. Then he stole the taser and ran and turned and fired it at the cop and the cop fired in defense. And now that cop's facing prison. So the cops now are probably thinking, I ain't getting involved in this. So crime's going to get worse. And it is across the board. Crime is getting worse. Murders are up basically everywhere. So they may not have successfully defunded the police, but the mayor still intervened and said, we're reforming. And the cops say, fine. I get a phone call about a bunch of minority children stealing a car. I ignore it. Especially this Antonio Brown guy. You think they're going to respond to this guy? That might be some comeuppance. That might be them being like, nah, he's on his own. But I doubt they knew who it was. I mean, maybe 911 dispatch probably said, what's your name, sir? And then relate it. And the cops were probably like, oh, this guy wants our help? Bro, if you don't want cops around, don't call the cops. If you want to defund the police, then who are you to call them for help? And then he says, I don't want to press charges. That's not how it works, bro. You called the cops. Stop playing these dirty games. Now, here's where we are. Refund the police, as in re-fund them. Fund them again. How U.S. cities are reversing cuts to police budgets and even increasing them by millions in New York City, Baltimore, and L.A. as violent crime surges. 1 year after many U.S. cities gave in to dramatic proposals to slash police department budgets, some are having second thoughts and quietly seeking to boost funding for cops as violent crime soars. The Democratic mayors of New York City, Baltimore, and Los Angeles are among those now backpedaling on their vows to defund the police as they face fury from residents over spiraling crime rates. Out of the nation's 20 largest police departments, city leaders have already submitted next year's budget proposals for 12. And 9 of those request funding increases ranging from 1% to 6%, according to the Wall Street Journal. The sea change comes a year after the murder of George Floyd. Meanwhile, the murder rate soared on an average of 30% across 34 major cities last year and has continued to increase dramatically this year in many places. So here we go. Oakland has proposed $27.3 million more. Minneapolis, $6.4 million more. New York, $92 million. Well, that may be more, but I think, didn't New York strip $1 billion from their police? And then crime skyrockets. Yeah, well, they're trying to get rid of the wealthy people. I can only assume that's their goal, because the people who can afford to flee do flee. And then what's left? Well, after the riots, they struggle to rebuild for generations. Like seriously, 2 or 3 generations, they struggle to rebuild. Rich people don't want to live there. Rich people don't need to live there. Rich people leave. And then, of course, we can talk about the very serious ramifications. L.A. increases their budget by proposes $50 million. Baltimore, $27 million. We have all of these people marching saying defund the police. Where are we at now? More funding for these cops. Why? Well, this pressure that was placed on these departments resulted in the good cops quitting. They opened up many positions that allow either bad cops or ideological cops. This can do one of 2 things. Ideological cops will praise Antifa and be like, thank you for what you're doing. And then they'll go and arrest you. You're anti-establishment. You're anti-woke. They march around giving the red salute. Who's going to get arrested in a confrontation? You are. I hope you don't think I'm joking. There's a woman in Florida who's facing 2 felony counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon with the intent to kill. Why? Because a violent mob ran up to her car and started banging on it, and she slowly idled through them, and one fell over and got hurt. And they said, well, you were trying to kill her. That's what's going to happen. The DAs will charge, the cops will arrest. So this refunding of the police, it's no joke. It's not a good thing. The cops have already been stripped, and the cops you like have left. And the new cops coming in are going to be bad cops. And if conservatives don't understand this, then it's only a matter of time before the department start arresting all the conservatives. And they've already started doing things like that. Regular people and conservatives, this is how it happens. You want to throw up the red salute? Okay, then you'll be okay. The DA will let you go so long as you pledge your fealty and raise the red salute. You know what the red salute is? It's the raised fist, like the Black Lives Matter symbol. Daily Mail says in New York City, Mayor Bill de Blasio reversed course and promised $92 million for a new precinct after scrapping the project last summer, as he vowed to slash the NYPD budget by $1 billion. So apparently they never did. Last month, de Blasio admitted that the initial funding cuts were his response to the environment of the moment, saying the city now has more funds available. Oh, well, there you go. That's it. They didn't defund the police. They just got the good cops to quit. In Baltimore, they say that I mentioned all of these cities. Let me show you this graph here. Percentage change in homicides, 2019 to 2020. Chula Vista, 150%. Chandler, 133. In Madison, 100. Milwaukee, 85. Lincoln, Omaha, Seattle, all of these cities. Now, in Baltimore, in Raleigh, Baltimore, St. Petersburg, and Virginia Beach, it looks like those numbers actually went down. I'm not gonna sit here and pander to any tribe and act like there's a 1-to-1 ratio between defunding the police and the increase in murders. COVID definitely played a role, and a variety of strategies were implemented. But in many of these cities where we've seen much more leftist activity, much more gun control and Democrat policy, there's been a substantial increase in the murder rate. They're going to mention that there was a major spike in April 20th through about July, and then it started to go down. So they mentioned the pandemic definitely contributed to this. And I think that's very important to point out. We can talk about police reform. We can talk about defunding the police and the escalation in crime. I do think it's fair to say, based on several data points, that there is a relation there. But COVID as the COVID lockdowns definitely played a huge role. Interestingly, it shouldn't have. And this is where things get a bit contradictory. So around the same time they mentioned the pandemic, we also have this red line, which I believe probably represents the mass protests and riots. It's hard to know exactly which. They say a point at which a structural break occurs in the data. So I don't know what that means. But at the same time as COVID, we had mass rioting. So it's hard to know exactly what was causing the crime. I do think both played a role. I think COVID played a big role. The lockdowns, people were desperate and broke. However, there were less people out on the street. So we were supposed to be seeing a decrease in crime. That's why I think defunding the police played a massive role in this. We saw windows get smashed out in small towns, many things that weren't reported by the media. Here's a quote. If you want to fix policing, you have to hire cops. You have to train them differently and hold them accountable. Chuck Wexler, the Police Executive Research Forum's executive director, told the Journal. The notion that taking away resources is going to improve policing is ridiculous. In New York, elected leaders have had to face facts as shootings soar and seemingly random attacks on strangers regularly make the headlines. Perhaps what we're really seeing is that the riots resulted in demoralization and police just didn't want to be involved anymore. They go to mention the massive increase in homicides, which for the most part we've covered and we know about. They also mentioned the Atlanta councilman who was nearly killed by carjackers. Cuomo said the crime wave threatened to derail the city's recovery from the pandemic, noting everything we just talked about. With the economy coming back, you know what the first step is? People have to feel safe. In a swipe at his political nemesis, de Blasio, the governor said that defunding the police was not the correct solution. Until you restore the trust and make the reforms necessary, we're going to have this problem. Defund the police is not the answer. It basically means abolish the police. Now, this is the important point. While we can go back and forth on COVID versus defunding the police, even some Democrats say defunding the police led to this escalation. That's the best I can say, I suppose. That's going to help. Gun violence is going up. All crimes going up. And that's going to help. No, it's reform so that the community says, I now trust the relationship. I am a lifelong New Yorker. I've seen this cycle over and over and over again. I remember getting on a subway train and making sure there was no jewelry, making sure you weren't wearing a chain. He said that was real. The tension between the state and local leaders also played out this week in Texas, where the state legislature is pushing a bill that would severely punish cities that defund their police departments. Aimed primarily at city leaders in Austin, the liberal-dominated state capital, HB 1900 passed the Texas Senate on Monday over the objections of Democrats. The bill would allow vast tracts of Austin that have been annexed since the 1990s to vote to secede from the city unless police funding is restored. The secession votes could severely hurt Austin's budget if they passed, decimating the city's tax base. The bill would bar Austin from re-annexing the areas for 10 years, and only if police funding is restored to prior levels. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, a Republican, has vowed to sign the bill into law. It comes as data continues to show a disturbing national increase in violent crime, with one study showing an increase of 1,200 murders last year compared to 2019. Quote, homicide rates were higher during every month of 2020 relative to rates from the previous year, states a report from the National Commission of COVID-19 and Criminal Justice. That said, rates increased significantly in June, well after the pandemic began, coinciding with the death of George Floyd and the mass protests that followed. So we saw police constrained, demoralized, attacked, demonized. One thing that happened was that because police were dealing with the violent riots, they couldn't respond to other crimes. And we're also seeing that the crime is dramatically increasing in minority neighborhoods, the murder specifically. That's being reported by the Wall Street Journal, which suggests it's Black Lives Matter. It's the activists. It's happening in specific neighborhoods. And it's happening because police resources are constrained. If it was COVID that was causing the majority of this, you'd see a uniform increase in crime. We don't. We see it predominantly in minority neighborhoods, which means in the suburbs where Wall Street Journal also reported, this is Axios, that police are making more arrests. The cities that defunded their police, it is negatively impacting minority neighborhoods. Ocasio-Cortez said she wanted policing to look more like the suburbs. That would mean more arrests, AOC. Instead, you're defunding the police. And instead, it is the minority neighborhoods that are facing the brunt of this. They are impoverished areas that can't afford their police or are. When you defund the police, who do you think's first affected? The 26-page study examined crime rates for 10 different offenses, including homicide, aggravated assault, and robbery in 34 American cities, ranging in size from Norfolk, Virginia, the smallest sample, to New York City, the largest. They go on to show this massive spike. Monthly motor vehicle theft skyrocketed between May and July, and they stayed high. That's crazy. Homicide rates were 30% higher than in 2019. However, property and drug crimes, with the exception of motor vehicle theft, fell significantly in 2020, a trend some researchers attribute to either less community willingness to report minor crimes or less proactive policing. This is another thing you need to understand, too. Homicides are one of the worst possible crimes you can commit. The police are going to respond to that. I mean, you have to deal with a body. But what if the police don't take a report on certain crimes? Then it just seems like crimes are going down. It's entirely possible that crimes are substantially higher than we realize, but they're not being reported, or police are not taking reports, and they're not responding. If that's true, it means crime is worse than anyone realizes. And that means you're going to be walking out of your car and a bunch of kids are going to jump in and steal it. And if you don't get real and say, they did this, they nearly killed me, it's only going to get worse. It's going to keep happening. They say that they're going to mention the numbers for many of these cities. The three largest cities, New York, LA, and Chicago, accounted for fully 40% of the additional people killed in 2020. While there is variation among the cities, what is most notable is that homicide rose substantially in the vast majority of them. Now, let's not play any games here, okay? If there is an increase in the percent of murders, you will see more murders in Chicago. I talked about this the other day. While Portland does see an 800% increase in crime, they had like 23 more murders, whereas Chicago had like 200. But 200 in Chicago is like 20-something%, and in Seattle, it's 800%. So because Chicago has substantially more murders, it looks like the percentage increase is lower. I mean, it is, but that's not really that fair. Chicago's got a lot of people, too, so maybe you take that into consideration. Chicago, New York, and LA as massive cities will have the bulk of the increase in murders just by proximity and population density alone. We can see everything that's been happening, though. We know everything that's been happening. Check this out. from the Hill. 5 arrested in connection with shooting of UK Black Lives Matter activist. A Black Lives Matter activist was at some event and a shooting happened. It was in London. How does a shooting happen in London with all this gun control? Why are these people shooting at each other? It's because certain, activists who don't want cops, this is the kind of stuff that happens. I'm not surprised by it. You take away funding for police, you see an increase in crime. I'm not a fan of unjust police action or police enforcing unconstitutional law, and I think we're dramatically close to, if not already in the point, where police start bending the knee to the Black Lives Matter activists. The activists that are enriching themselves. Here's the story you may have seen from the New York Post. Inside BLM co-founder Patrice Kahn-Kuller's $1 million real estate buying binge. They defund the police. They say the police are bad. They make millions, if not $1 billion plus, in fundraising off of the lies. Then the cities suffer for it. And what do? They once again blame the police. And that's the point. They want to make more money. They want to perpetuate the lies. So we saw this guy in Atlanta, Antonio Brown, and he's saying it's generational poverty and racism because he needs to maintain the lie, critical race theory. He needs to keep telling you it's always going to be racism. Some kids just stole your car, dude. The fact that you won't call them out, in my opinion, is racist. Because sometimes kids just commit crimes, whether they're rich or poor or black or white. But there you go. They're going to keep claiming it's not their fault. It's the system. That's who's at fault. And they're going to make more and more demands. Black Lives Matter fights disinformation to keep the movement strong. And with their allies in media pushing the lies, it will persist. It will likely get worse. NPR reports. They mention George Floyd. They say George Floyd died. Support for Black Lives Matter, the movement that actually began, the hashtag surged. To this day, posts on social media continue to call for racial justice. But also online are posts riddled with disinformation, including those specifically targeting BLM. The activists charge that those disparaging posts are part of an overall effort to undermine the movement and its message. Sure, maybe some people somewhere. But when we see Antifa and Black Lives Matter go around smashing up windows and burning down buildings, and then we hear from Democrats, it's all not true. And then we hear from their allies in media, it's not true. And these people don't even know what's happening. Where's the real disinformation? Where's the real omission? Now, we may be falling into a trap, many of us, because we see so much news about Black Lives Matter and Antifa riots. We think the entire city's on fire. But I think most people who are watching videos like this one right now are more discerning than that and recognize there are some violent instances. There are some fires. It's happening too much and it should stop. But it's, of course, not the entire city. Now, let me break something down for you. The lies they push. They say it was only in one part of the city where the riots were happening. In Ferguson, they say, conservatives said the city was burning down. It was just one city block, West Florissant. I mean, it was pretty long. I think it was like a mile where they torched all these buildings in Ferguson. Most of you probably know my story from Egypt. When I was in Egypt, I could see Tahrir Square from my window. I was watching the revolution of several thousand people jumping up and down. Yet a few blocks away was a McDonald's where a guy was watching soccer and eating a burger. I don't know what he was eating. He was eating a burger or something. Whatever he was eating, fries, it's McDonald's. Life was normal. I mean, not really, but it's not like people think it is. This was literally a country in revolution. And you could travel, I don't know how many miles to Heliopolis and go to the mall. And I did. And I'm walking around. They had drones for sale or something like that. And they had cell phones. And I got like kebab. And it was delicious. You could go inside the hotel only a few blocks from Tahrir and gamble. When you hear stories about several city blocks of riots, you need to understand that's led to revolution several times. The journalists will say, so long as the entire city isn't on fire, you're lying and it's not that big of a deal. When I was in Baltimore during the riots, it was the entire city. It was the entire city. Now, of course, the rioting was isolated in one part of the city, but we were driving around and you'd see just like 2 or 3 people smashing windows and climbing in, stealing stuff, and it was all over. It makes it harder for people to climb out of poverty when everyone's just stealing from each other and destroying each other's businesses and lives. The left steps in and then defends it and says, oh, it's just proof that we should do more. The more they do, the worse things seem to get. You get to the point where one of these guys leaves his car and children steal it. And what does he do? He says, I almost killed myself and I didn't want to hurt him and I won't press charges. Let me know how that works out for you. He didn't care, though. He doesn't want to offend the tribe or get canceled. So these lunatics will keep pushing policy that will keep making things worse. I'll leave it there. Next segment's coming up at youtube.com/TimCastIRL at 8 p.m. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you all next time.